The Aircraft Action Report for Bombing Squadron 5, dated May 8, 1942, runs 11 pages. It is filed at the National Archives at College Park, Maryland, in Record Group 38. On page 7, the entry for Lieutenant, Junior Grade, Stanley Winfield Vejtasa, flying an SBD-3 Dauntless dive bomber from USS Yorktown, lists 3 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters destroyed in the air. The note in the margin, in pencil, in a hand that is not Vejtasa's, reads in substance, "Pilot declined to file separate claim. Other pilots in his division put the number higher. 5 zeros, possibly 6. Vejtasa never corrected them. He also never wrote a word to support them. For 71 years, until his death at 98 in January 2013 in Coronado, California, he kept the same line. 3 was what the squadron could verify. 3 was what the action report said. 3 was what he would sign for." Anything past that lived in the recollections of other men who had been busy keeping their own scout bomber out of the water. This is the puzzle of Swede Vejtasa. 2 Navy Crosses, a Distinguished Flying Cross, credit, eventually, for 11 aerial victories across 2 carriers and 2 of the worst fighting days the Pacific Fleet ever had. And somewhere underneath the ribbons, a stack of kills he refused to put his name to. Historians have argued the count for decades. Some, like Barrett Tillman and John Lundstrom, went back to the squadron logs and the Japanese loss records and reconstructed his fights nearly minute by minute. The numbers do not quite match. They have never quite matched. What survives are the planes that hit the water, the men who saw them go in, and Vejtasa's stubborn refusal to claim more than the Navy could prove. Lundstrom, in the first team, his exhaustive study of Navy carrier combat from Pearl Harbor through Guadalcanal, put it carefully, Vejtasa's official credits are conservative, and the man wanted them that way. The story the title of this video promises, 5 zeros downed by 1 American pilot in a single sortie, is real in the sense that it happened over the Coral Sea on the morning of May 8, 1942. It is also a story the pilot himself spent the rest of his life refusing to tell. To understand why, you have to go back to the aircraft he was flying that morning. Not a Wildcat, not a Hellcat, a Douglas SBD-3 Dauntless, a 2-seat dive bomber with a 1,000-pound bomb under its belly, 2.50 caliber guns in the nose, and a single rear-facing .30 in the back seat for the radio man gunner. The Dauntless was not a fighter. It was barely an air-to-air gun platform. Against the A6M20, faster, more maneuverable, lighter armed but lighter built, the SBD was prey. In May 1942, the entire Pacific War hung on a handful of these airplanes and the men who flew them. One of them was a 27-year-old from Circle, Montana, who had decided he was not going to die over the Coral Sea that day. He nearly did. So did the zeros that came after him. Stanley Winfield Vejtasa was born July 27, 1914, in Circle, Montana, a county seat town of fewer than 400 people in the eastern half of the state, closer to the Dakotas than to anything else. He played football and basketball at Montana State College in Bozeman, graduated in 1937 with a degree in agriculture, and went into the Navy because the Navy was hiring and Montana was not. He earned his wings at Pensacola in 1939 and was posted to Scouting Squadron 5, VS-5, aboard USS Yorktown. By the standards of naval aviation in the late 1930s, this was a quiet career. He flew SBDs. He learned the dive. He picked up the nickname Swede from his Czech immigrant surname, which other pilots could not pronounce and did not try. When the war started on December 7, 1941, Yorktown was in the Atlantic, escorting convoys against U-boats off Argentia, Newfoundland. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, had her sent through the Panama Canal to the Pacific within 10 days. By February 1942, she was raiding the Marshalls and Gilberts. By April, she was in the Coral Sea, screening Australia against a Japanese push southeast through the Solomon Islands toward Port Moresby. VS-5's job in early 1942 was scouting, long patrols across empty water, looking for masthead silhouettes. Vejtasa logged hundreds of hours flying in formation behind Lieutenant Commander William O. Birch, the squadron commander, a man who would survive the war and retire a rear admiral. The scouts found ships. The bombers, VB-5, flying the same SBDs, sank them. By the standards of the Pacific Fleet in April 1942, this was about as good as it got. The reorganization that put Vejtasa into the fight on May 8 was the kind of paperwork most squadrons did without comment. VS-5 and VB-5 were temporarily consolidated under Birch for the Coral Sea operation, with crews swapped between scout and bomber roles depending on the mission. Vejtasa drew a strike slot. On May 7, 1942, he was one of 24 SBDs that lifted off Yorktown's deck to hit the Japanese light carrier Shoho, 300 miles to the north. Shoho went down in 20 minutes. The source of Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon's radio call, "Scratch one flat top," which made the front page of nearly every American newspaper the following morning. Vejtasa was somewhere in that strike. His name does not appear in the headlines. His logbook, now held at the National Museum of Naval Aviation in Pensacola, lists the date, the time, the airframe number, and a single word: strike. He came back. He slept perhaps 4 hours. At 08:05 on May 8th, he was airborne again, this time on a search mission, paired in a two-plane scout section, looking for the heavy carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, which Yorktown's intelligence officers were now certain were out there, somewhere northeast, doing exactly what Yorktown was doing, hunting them. The pairing for that May 8th search was unusual. Vejtasa, the more junior pilot, was wingman to Lieutenant Commander Birch. 2 SBDs, alone, hundreds of miles from the carrier, no fighter escort, no radio contact, looking for 2 Japanese flat tops with combat air patrols of A6 M20s stacked overhead. The SBD was not a fighter. Birch and Vejtasa both knew that. They found the Japanese carriers shortly after 0900. They were also found. What happened next is reconstructed mostly from Birch's and Vejtasa's own post-war accounts, from VS-5's squadron diary, and from Japanese carrier air group records translated for American researchers in the decades after the surrender. The accounts agree on the broad shape. They do not entirely agree on the count. Birch saw the zeros first. There were 6 of them, possibly 8, A6M2 fighters from Shokaku's combat air patrol, climbing fast from below and behind. Birch broke radio silence to call the contact, shoved his SBD into a diving turn back toward Yorktown, and the fight began. The 2 Dauntlesses were separated almost immediately. Birch dove low, hugging the water, hoping the zeros would not follow into the bad gun aspect a high deflection shot on a fleeing dive bomber requires. Some did not. Some did. Birch took hits in his wing and rear cockpit. His gunner returned fire with the rear .30 until it jammed. Birch made it back to Yorktown with 1-0 claimed, and his airplane shot through in 19 places. Vejtasa did not dive. He turned into the attack. This decision, counterintuitive to anyone trained to think of an SBD as a target rather than a shooter, is the heart of the story. The Dauntless had 2 strengths in a dogfight: its nose-mounted .5s, which threw a heavy punch in a head-on pass, and its rugged construction, which let it absorb hits that would shred a zero. Vejtasa used both. He turned hard into each successive zero attack, took the head-on shot, and used his airplane like a slow, stubborn fighter pilot's airplane. He shot the first zero down at around 0935. He watched it pass him trailing smoke and saw it hit the water. He shot down a second within a minute. A third followed sometime in the next 4 minutes. The timestamps in the Japanese records and the American debriefs do not quite line up, and Vejtasa himself could never put them in order afterward. His radioman gunner killed a zero off Vejtasa's tail with the rear .30, the kind of shot an SBD's backseater was theoretically allowed to make and almost never did. The gunner's claim is in the squadron diary. It is not in Vejtasa's report. By the time Vejtasa broke contact and turned for Yorktown, the Japanese formation had given up. He saw water spray columns he could not account for. He saw oil slicks. He saw, on the way home, an SBD that was not Birch's, a 3rd Yorktown aircraft, lost and shot up, that he led back to the carrier and that landed safely behind him. He filed his report that afternoon. He wrote down 3 zeros. He left the spaces for additional claims blank. The men in the ready room did not. Within an hour of the recovery, Birch was telling anyone who would listen that Vejtasa had taken 5 down. 2 other VS-5 pilots, who had picked up fragments of the fight from altitude as they returned from other tasks, said something close to the same. The squadron intelligence officer, debriefing pilots one at a time across the late afternoon, wrote in the diary that evening that the most defensible count was 5 zeros to Vejtasa and 1 to his rear gunner. The number was on the diary page in pencil. It was not on Vejtasa's report. By the time the Air Group Yorktown summary went to Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's flag intelligence officer, the consolidated number was 3. The man with the kills, Asked again that night by Birch in the wardroom, gave the answer he would give for the next 71 years. He had only seen 3 of them hit the water. The U.S. Navy in May 1942 did not have a settled procedure for aerial victory credits. It would not have one until 1943, and the post-war audit of claims would not be completed until the late 1940s. In practice, a kill in spring 1942 was credited on a combination of pilot statement, witness statement from other pilots in the same engagement, and, when available, physical evidence such as recovered wreckage or, very occasionally, gun camera film. In Vejtasa's case, none of the supporting categories worked the way they were supposed to. There was no gun camera film. SBDs of the period were not equipped with one. There was no recovered wreckage. The Zeros went into open ocean 300 miles from any American base. The only witness who saw the full engagement was the gunner sitting 2 feet behind Vejtasa, and his account agreed with his pilots: 3 confirmed kills, several more probable. The pilots who put the number higher were back at Yorktown. They had seen Vejtasa come in low and intact when no one in the ready room expected him at all. They had heard the gunner's count over the backseat intercom on the way home. Birch, debriefed first, said Vejtasa had downed at least 5. The squadron intelligence officer entered the same figure in the diary. The figure stayed there. It never moved up the chain. Vejtasa would not sign the higher claim. According to a recollection later passed to John Lundstrom and preserved in Lundstrom's working files at the Naval History and Heritage Command, Vejtasa's reasoning was practical and unromantic. He had not, he said, seen the 4th and 5th Zeros hit the water. He had hit them. He believed they were going down. He could not swear to it. Putting his name to a claim he could not personally verify struck him as something between bad faith and bad math. The Navy split the difference. The audit credited Vejtasa with 3 zeros for May 8, 1942. The Navy Cross citation he was awarded, signed at Pearl Harbor by Admiral Chester Nimitz on a day when Nimitz had other things on his mind, 3,000 miles away near Midway, used the more cautious framing. It cites extraordinary heroism and distinguished service as pilot of a scout bomber attached to USS Yorktown during action against enemy Japanese forces in the Coral Sea on May 8, 1942. It does not name a count, it names the action. This kind of administrative caution was not, in May 1942, neutral. Aerial victory credits drove promotions, magazine covers, war bond tours, and the assignment to more interesting jobs. Vejtasa would have known. He took the 3 and went back to work. The choice was noticed. Within 2 months, he was pulled out of scout bomber duty entirely and sent to fighter training at Naval Air Station Maui, in the territory of Hawaii. The man who put him through transition was Lieutenant Commander James H. Flatley, Jr., Jimmy Flatley, future Vice Admiral, then commanding the newly stood-up Fighting Squadron 10, the Grim Reapers. Flatley wanted Vejtasa because Flatley had read the May 8th report. He had also talked to Birch. He understood what Vejtasa had done in a Dauntless and what the same temperament might do in an F-4F-4 Wildcat, a real fighter with 6 wing-mounted .5s, an armored cockpit, and self-sealing fuel tanks. Flatley's standing view of the Wildcat, recorded in his squadron correspondence now held at the Naval History and Heritage Command, was that the airplane was adequate in the hands of an aggressive pilot and a death trap in the hands of a passive one. He thought Vejtasa was the first kind. He had a few months to find out. VF-10 worked up through the summer of 1942 at Maui and at Naval Air Station Pearl Harbor, flying ground-controlled intercepts, gunnery on towed sleeves, and section tactics, the 2-plane, 4-plane structure that Lieutenant Commander John Thatch had developed and that the Navy was now teaching as doctrine. Vejtasa, the senior pilot in the squadron in actual combat experience despite his junior rank, helped Flatley write the syllabus. He was promoted to lieutenant in August. He was given command of one of the 4-plane divisions. By October, he was aboard USS Enterprise, headed south into the South Pacific, where the Guadalcanal Campaign was 3 months old and the U.S. Navy was running out of carriers. The arithmetic by mid-October 1942 was grim. Wasp had been torpedoed and lost on September 15th. Saratoga was at Pearl with torpedo damage. Yorktown had gone down at Midway on June 7th. Hornet and Enterprise were the only American fleet carriers in the Pacific. Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, who had relieved Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley as commander of the South Pacific area on October 18, 1942, knew that the loss of either carrier would put the surface line in front of Tokyo's strike groups without air cover. Halsey, characteristically, sent both north to fight anyway. The fight came on October 26, 1942, at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. The Japanese had 4 carriers up: Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, and the light carrier Zuiho. The Americans had Enterprise and Hornet. The Japanese struck first. By mid-morning, Hornet was on fire and dead in the water. By mid-afternoon, the Japanese strike groups were turning back toward Enterprise. Vejtasa was airborne on combat air patrol over Enterprise. His division, call sign Reaper 7, was vectored north and west under direction of Enterprise's fighter director officer, working from a CXAM-1 radar plot in the carrier's Combat Information Center. The director was managing what would be one of the largest CAP intercept actions of the Pacific War. 8 to 12 Japanese strike formations were coming in waves. Vejtasa took his 4-plane division into the first inbound wave shortly after 11:15. The Japanese strike consisted of Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers from Junyo with a 0 escort. Vejtasa's after-action statement, dated October 28, 1942, and held at NARA in Record Group 38, describes what happened in the next 45 minutes with a kind of administrative dryness that does not match the math. He claimed 2 Vals from the first wave. Then, vectored against a second formation of Nakajima B-5N, Kate torpedo bombers from Shokaku coming in low against Enterprise, he claimed 5 more. 7 aircraft, 1 sortie, less than an hour. This time, several of the kills were watched by other American pilots, by destroyer gun crews looking up, and by an SBD pilot orbiting at altitude waiting for his own attack run. The witnesses were not in short supply. The destroyer USS Smith, which had been hit by a Kate that crashed into her bow shortly after, confirmed 3 torpedo bombers down from Vejtasa's quadrant within the relevant time window. The CXAM radar plot, preserved at NHHC, shows the Japanese formation breaking up exactly where Vejtasa's statement says it did. The count, again, was the problem. Flatly filed for 7. The squadron filed for 7. The Bureau of Aeronautics, when it got around to its post-war audit against Japanese unit loss records, did not. The Bureau audit was less generous than the squadron paper. In the post-war reconciliation against Japanese records, the same process that trimmed American claims across the Pacific War by roughly 30% on average, Vejtasa's October 26 score was reduced to 5 confirmed aircraft destroyed. The 2 Vals from the first wave were trimmed. One of the 2 was reassigned to another VF-10 pilot whose claim overlapped, and 1 was put down as a shared kill, which in the Bureau's later accounting did not count as a full credit. 5 for Santa Cruz, 3 for Coral Sea. Other credits, smaller and across the same 2 carriers, brought his official total to 11 aircraft destroyed. 11 made him an ace twice over. 11 was also, by the math of the men who had been in the air with him on October 26 and on May 8, low. Lundstrom, working from Japanese loss records in the 1970s and 1980s, concluded that Vejtasa's actual victory count was probably between 13 and 15. Barrett Tillman, in his History of the F-4F Wildcat published by the Naval Institute Press in 1990, used the higher figure and treated it as the more accurate count. Vejtasa did not push it, he never pushed any of it. After Santa Cruz, he flew CAP through the rest of the Guadalcanal Campaign and then rotated back to the United States in early 1943, instructing at Naval Air Station Daytona Beach in Florida for the next 2 years. He was promoted to lieutenant commander. He flew operationally again briefly in 1945. He stayed in the Navy after the war. He commanded Air Group 2 on USS Essex in 1953. He commanded the destroyer escort USS Lewis in 1956, a sea command unusual for an aviator and a sign that the Navy thought of him as more than a pilot. He commanded the attack carrier USS Constellation as her first commanding officer when she was commissioned at the Brooklyn Navy Yard on October 27, 1961, 21 years to the week after Santa Cruz. He retired as a captain in 1970. In the few oral histories he gave, to the U.S. Naval Institute in 1976, to John Lundstrom in 1979, and to a Pacific War Symposium at the Admiral Nimitz Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas in 1992, he was asked every time about the numbers. He answered every time the same way. He had filed what he could verify. The men who flew with him had filed what they had seen. The Navy had done the audit. The audit was the audit. He was not interested in revising it upward. When a younger officer at the Nimitz Symposium pressed him on the Coral Sea fight, 5 zeros, the man insisted, not 3. Vejtasa, by then 78 years old, repeated what he had said since 1942. The number on the action report was the number he was prepared to defend. He was not interested in another number. The Navy, by the early 1990s, was beginning to be interested in another number. Quietly. Not for Vejtasa specifically, for the whole audit. The Naval History and Heritage Command had started a project to revisit aerial victory credits across the Pacific War, using Japanese unit loss records that had not been fully available to the original Bureau of Aeronautics audit in the late 1940s. Most of the post-war Japanese aviation records had been microfilmed at the end of the occupation, and then sat, largely unconsulted, in the Defense Agency archives in Tokyo. American researchers, Lundstrom, James Saruk, Henry Sakida, spent the 1980s working through them. What they found in the case of one pilot from Circle, Montana, took the form of arithmetic. The Japanese records of the Shokaku Air Group for May 8, 1942, list 50 pilots failing to return from the Coral Sea action that morning. 2 of those 5 are credited to other VS-5 pilots and to Birch in independent engagements. 1 is credited to Yorktown's Combat Air Patrol, which had its own fight that day. That leaves 2 zero losses on May 8, 1942, that the Japanese records cannot account for anyway except by attributing them to the SBDs of VS-5's morning search, which is to say, to Birch and Vejtasa, both of whom were in the air, both of whom were shooting. The arithmetic does not, on its own, vindicate the higher claim. It does suggest that the squadron's original number, 5 zeros to Vejtasa, plus the gunner's kill, was not invented. It was at most optimistic. At least, it was within the margin of error of what the Japanese themselves recorded losing that morning to dive bombers that should not, by every doctrinal assumption on either side, have been able to shoot down a zero at all. None of this was ever raised as a formal request to upgrade Vejtasa's official credit. He would not have asked. The Navy was not going to volunteer. He died on January 23, 2013, in Coronado, California, at the age of 98. The obituaries in the San Diego Union Tribune and the New York Times listed 2 Navy crosses, a Distinguished Flying Cross, command of 2 warships, and the Standard 11 aerial victories of the Bureau audit. They did not mention the higher number. He had not wanted the higher number. The obituary writers were giving him what he had asked for. There is one document, held among his papers donated to the National Museum of Naval Aviation in Pensacola, Florida, that is sometimes pointed to as Vejtasa's own quiet ledger. It is a single-typed page, undated, in the form of a list. Down the left margin are dates: May 7th, 42, May 8th, 42, May 8th, 42, May 8th, 42, October 26th, 42, October 26th, 42, and so on. Down the right margin are aircraft types: a Type 96 carrier bomber, 3 zeros, 2 vowels, 5 cates, and others. The total of the entries is 13. Whether Vejtasa typed it himself, or whether it was prepared for him by a researcher and left in his files unsigned, the museum cannot now say. The page bears no annotation. There is no signature at the bottom. The man who would have been able to confirm it is dead. What the page shows is a count he never filed. The bureau number stays at 11. The squadron number from October 1942 stays at 7 on October 26th. The May 8th number stays at 3. The page in Pensacola sits in a folder of working papers, between a logbook and a hand-corrected map of the Coral Sea. It is not a claim. It looks like one. The man who would have had to sign it never did. What the rest of the record makes clear is that on the morning of May 8, 1942, a Navy lieutenant junior grade flying the wrong kind of airplane against the right kind of enemy fought a 4-plane Zero division to a standstill over open ocean, and walked back into a Yorktown ready room that wanted to give him 5 and a gunner. He took 3. He kept taking 3 for 7 decades. The number on the page is not the number that hit the water. It is the number he was willing to put his name to.